Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And good to see you all here today. So starting the new year, we, through November and December, we were studying the Mountains and Waters Sutra of Master Dogen in some depth. But I thought in starting the new year, we would go back to some very foundational teachings in Buddhism. Talk about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Using the text, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta from the Pali Canon as a guide. Many people have written commentaries on this, and I don't approach it as a scriptural scholar by any means. There are many people who know much, much more about the scholarship than I do. And I don't approach it as a lifelong monastic either. Someone who could recite this by memory. But I approach it as a layperson trying to understand Buddhist practice and what it means, what we're trying to do. Recently, I reread a book by David Brazier, aka Dharma Vidya, called The Feeling Buddha, which he says is his best-selling book. And in it, he presents a novel approach to understanding of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. You don't have to agree with or resonate with every aspect of his interpretation in order to benefit, I think, from his deep thought about these teachings. And I'm sure that my understanding of these teachings has been influenced by reading that book and my interactions with Dharma Vidya. So I was going to just start by talking about dukkha, so-called, suffering, unease, stress, the first of the Noble Truths. But I was taken with the first part of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which translates, by the way, turning the wheel of Dharma or Dhamma, or setting in motion the wheel of Dhamma. In other words, getting the Buddha's teachings off to a start, transmitting them to at least one person, with the idea that if they can be transmitted to one person, they can be transmitted to many people. So I think I'll just read this first section of the sutta as translated by Tanisaro, and then discuss it a little bit with a bit of a prequel. I have heard on one occasion the Blessed One, the Buddha, was staying near Varanasi in the Deer Park at Isipatana. There he addressed the group of 5 monks. There are these 2 extremes, he said, that are not to be indulged in by one who has gone forth. Which 2? That which is devoted to sensual pleasure in connection with sensuality, base, vulgar, common, ignoble, unprofitable. That which is devoted to self-affliction is the other. Painful, ignoble, unprofitable. Avoiding both of these extremes, the middle way was realized by the Tathagata, by himself. Producing vision, producing knowledge, which leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. And what is the middle way realized by the Tathagata? That producing vision, producing knowledge leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. Precisely this noble eightfold path. Right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the middle way realized by the Tathagata. That producing vision, producing knowledge, leads to stilling, to direct knowledge, to awakening, and to unbinding. So as I've revisited this sutta, I've developed a notion, and again, all of what I say or what anyone says sort of corresponds to current understanding. There's no limit to the depth of the Dharma. Therefore, one's understanding is constantly evolving. But my understanding of this teaching, I guess, can be crystallized into three things: awareness, intention, and redirection. And conveniently, the acronym for those would be AIR, A-I-R, which supplies relief for the suffocation of self-absorption that we're all susceptible to. So there was a backstory, of course, to this speech that the Buddha gave. And the backstory, I won't go back to the very beginning, but of course, you're all familiar with basically the Buddha's story, and how at a certain point in his life, he embarked on a spiritual journey, which lasted for 6 years, as the story goes. And near the end of that journey, he had been with a group of 5 ascetics practicing really physically punishing practices and deprivation, culminating in a 49-day fast that the Buddha was at the end of as he sat down below a banyan tree to meditate. And then there's the legend of Sujata. I guess I use the word legend advisedly because legend is essentially the Latin word for legend, or the Latin root for legend is legere, which is to read, like to read a story. And it's closely related to the Greek derivative mythos, myth. And these, you'll see various versions of these stories. So, they can't be all necessarily factually true, which I think is irrelevant. Because a work of fiction can be true as a statement of human experience, even though it is factually imagined. So whether or not these legends are factual or not, I think is in a way beside the point. They have survived for 2,500 years as a guide for individuals seeking meaning in their lives. So anyway, there's the legend of Sujata. So Sujata, as the story goes, was the daughter of a wealthy farmer who had land in the area or nearby where the Buddha was sitting under the banyan tree. And Sujata, earlier in her life, had desperately wanted, having been married, she desperately wanted a son. It was a patriarchal society, so there was a premium on having a son. And she desperately wanted a son, so she, it was common practice at that time to believe in tree spirits, which may or may not exist. But she went to that particular banyan tree and asked the tree spirit to grant her a son. She subsequently conceived and delivered a son. And then she wanted to thank the tree spirit. So she devised an offering of milk and rice. It's I've seen it described as kind of a rice pudding that is a traditional dish. And if you go to Indian restaurants now, you'll see in the dessert section, there'll be some fruit and then there'll be some rice pudding. So I imagine it's in a way kind of similar to what's served at Indian restaurants. But in any case, milk and rice. So she sent her servant girl to prepare the site near the banyan tree for the offering. And the servant girl came back and said, "There's a man there. There's a man sitting under the tree, and he looks very thin and pale." So Sujata was pleased because she thought, "Oh, this was an incarnation of the tree spirit. So I'll offer my rice and milk to this person, this spirit." So she, prepares the rice in a golden bowl, and sort of a fancy thing because she wants to make a suitable offering, and brings it to the banyan tree and sees the Buddha, who is not yet the Buddha. He's Siddhartha or Shakyamuni, and he's sitting there very wasted from not eating anything substantial for 49 days. And she offers him the pudding. And of course, he was at first kind of conflicted about it because he's trying to do this ascetic practice. He's been at it for a long time, and this is something that sort of violates his practice. But Sujata says, eating too much is not healthy, but eating not enough is also not healthy. Just eating an appropriate amount, a moderate amount is what's healthy. So take the rice and milk and take it, eat it, have it. So the Buddha does. And he gains nourishment from the rice and milk. And then, which this allows him to survive the night. And during that night, he is awakened. So in some sense, you could say that this all happened sort of by accident, that Sujata mistook him for a tree spirit. And you could also say that the original teachings of the middle way were not something the Buddha came up with, but something that Sujata came up with. And you could also say that the awakening was prompted by a simple act of kindness, feeding somebody who is hungry. But in any case, the Buddha then ate the rice and milk and sat through the night, and then I guess received, in a way, these teachings, and then passed them on to the 5 ascetics. Now, initially, the 5 ascetics were skeptical because they thought, well, this Siddhartha guy, he was just kind of weak. I mean, he can't deal with these practices. But they noticed about the Buddha when they encountered him, as the story goes, a kind of glow. And were curious. They thought, well, there's something different. Something's changed. Something is transformed here. So they were willing to listen to the Buddha as he recited what he had learned. So that's sort of the backstory to this Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. And then the Buddha goes on to talk about dukkha, suffering, unease, stress, the source of dukkha, or I guess the precursor of dukkha, one might say, desire, thirst, wanting things to be other than the way they are, the possibility for freeing oneself from this cycle of thirst and dukkha, freeing oneself in some manner, and we'll get to that in time. And the path that is helpful in cultivation of the skill of freeing oneself, unbinding, the Eightfold Path. So this story of Sujata is kind of a curious one. Suggesting a kind of coincidence that resulted in the Buddha's awakening, suggesting how this encounter with Sujata was instrumental in allowing the Buddha to awaken, and how a simple act of kindness, whatever the motivation might be, can sometimes have a transformative effect. So I guess I'll stop there, and maybe we can think about how something that someone said, something that someone did, something that you said or something that you did seemed to have a transformational effect. Seemed to redirect the entire situation. Seemed to reframe whatever it was that was going on and transform it. Discuss that possibility. So we'll stop there. And thank you for listening this morning. We'll break up into smaller groups, a couple of them, and then reconvene in just a few moments.